This episode of the eDesign It podcast is sponsored by Microchip Technology. Make the move to high voltage silicon carbide with ease, speed, and confidence. Microchip Technology's new 3.3 kilovolt silicon carbide MOSFETs and Schottky barrier diodes deliver advanced efficiency and reliability for your high voltage power systems. Unveiled last month at APEC 2022, the MOSFETs give you the industry's lowest on resistance of just 25 milliohms. And with the Schottky barrier diodes, you get the industry's highest current rating of 90 amps. Plus, you can get either of these power devices as a die or packaged. To learn more, visit microchip.com/APEC 2022. All right, guys, I'm Nicolette, and today Brian and I are here with Nathan Prey, Margaret Cunha, and Mike Rankins from DigiKey. We have a DigiKey Dream Team here with us today to talk with us about supply chain issues. And like we were joking about before, I don't know if you've heard, but there's a shortage, right? So we've got some issues going on in the industry, and we're going to talk a little bit about solutions to combat those. So thank you all for joining us. We're super excited to have three of you with us today.
Great. Thanks,
we decided to tag
excited
team.
to be here.
I know. They decided they were going to outnumber us today, right?
I like it. All right. So, I mean, let's talk about the not so big elephant in the room. Let's talk about shortages. And guys, feel free. Whoever wants to jump in and tackle anything, go for it. And
well, I have a question around shortages, right?
Are there
any particular areas you guys are really seeing more shortages in than others, right? Like, what areas are really seeing the most shortages at this point?
I from my side, I think the biggest issue, and we talk about the elephant in the room, is semiconductor chips, right? It's in the news. People talk about it. It impacts our life every day, right? With cars and computers, and there's so many problems with that. So that's really the biggest area that we tend to deal with is the semiconductor chip shortage. So, one of the things that I've looked at from that commodity is it was once just capacity. And now we're talking about other issues that are going on in the world. It was capacity, it was freight, and now with the Ukraine and the Russia conflict, right, that's added another element. Apparently there's a gas it's a neon gas that's produced in Ukraine. It's 80 to 90% of the world's supply comes from the Ukraine. Wow. And that goes into the production of semiconductor wafers. So, it's like a confluence of problems that just keep coming at this one element. But from our standpoint, that's the biggest one for us. Add to that freight and other things. So. Margaret.
Yeah, logistics, raw material. I think they're calling it the predictability of unpredictability in 2022, right? We're just trying to assess how the supply chain is so fragile. That's a big aha. We've all learned that. And there's just folks that are trying to get extremely creative. Just this week alone, I heard 3 different versions that the automakers are actually starting to take all their auxiliary chips, anything tied to, the niceties, the GPSs, the things that aren't necessarily tied to safety or a requirement for driving, and just pushing the product through to get it out, which is going to be super interesting to see on the back end. Once the chips are available, are you going to take your time to send your car back in to get certain things loaded back in? Right. It's going to be really interesting from a financial standpoint to see where then this next step takes the supply chain as well. It's tough. This is tough. It's not easy. Customers are struggling. Suppliers are struggling to support them. And there isn't any one simple answer because it's across the board. So many different pieces of the supply chain are impacted.
Sorry, Nicolette.
Interesting. I was just thinking, I'm not, exactly chip related. I'm thinking about the end user then who's purchasing a vehicle, and now you're still marking up the vehicle. But I don't know.
Right?
Are we still marking up the vehicle even though we don't have all of those niceties in there?
It's like you're going to pay more money for the car, but you're not going to have your GPS. But maybe we'll give you your GPS in 2 years, right? Like that's almost what we're saying here.
Well, and it's interesting because my son just bought a new car. Not new to him, used, and that was the first thing he didn't want was the GPS. I'll use my phone. I don't need the GPS.
Exactly.
So you're going to have that generational requirement as well, right? There's certain things that I would want in a car that, say, a 20 something would not want in a car. It's gonna all change. That all comes into the consumer wants, and that's what's going to drive the supply chain as well. So it was interesting. We had an interesting lunch conversation over it with a couple engineers.
I mean, what's really interesting about that, so let's back up, I guess probably like 25 years, right? You didn't really have those computer chips in cars, right? Or you did, but they were very minor. Are we going to see it almost backing up to there, and where now you're plugging in your other device, now that you're telling me, because I mean, I do the same thing. I never use the GPS, even if it's in my car.
I don't use any of those features.
Right.
And when I go there, I'm like, I don't need anything. I have my phone. Right. I'm good. I don't want your Sirius XM. I don't want your GPS. I don't want your lady who doesn't shut up and the OnStar. I don't want it. I've got the phone and I'm good.
And you stream straight from your phone. But I mean, it's interesting too, because now you're using all your data portion of your phone, right? So it's definitely a give and take. But I mean, it's interesting to see, is it going to sort of back up a little bit? Where cars are, I don't want to say they're going to be dumbed down, because they're going to need all the safety features like you're talking about. Right. But are they going to start losing some of that other technology, and that's going to be replaced by the individual's device?
Mm-hmm. But if it's not that, what's the next new gadget that's going to go into that car? When you were talking, I was thinking about 2018 and the MLCC shortage, right? One of the problems with MLCCs, they go into there's a lot of sensors and things like that. Well, 10, 20 years ago, there was probably 1,000 MLCCs in a car, and now there's over 10,000. So think about sensors, and every time you turn, a car goes by you, your mirror lights up, and all of those things that happen, right? So they just continue. That's one of the other issues, right? Is you get so many more things technology-wise going into the car that are electronic driven, and so you add to that then all of the new bells and whistles that go into all the cell phones, and then Internet of Things that you've got going on, and more people are home and wanting to put in their Nest or their, I don't want to give anybody a commercial here, but they want to put in their Ring or all of these things. All of those things are just adding up to that. And, COVID, and that's what I call the confluence of problems. So,
do you guys think it's going to slow down, the autonomous vehicle sort of push?
I was just thinking the same thing.
I don't see it. So I'm in California. And there just seems to be more and more, startups and companies that are looking at LiDAR, looking at the EV, looking at all of the support features for that industry. I'm not feeling it today. I don't feel the slowdown. I feel that there's a lot of demand. I feel that there's a lot of energy around it, a lot of focus, a lot of support, a lot of financial support. So I don't see that. I don't know. Mike, Nathan, do you agree? You're on different coastlines and
we have a major customer in Florida that they haven't slowed down one bit. They continue to drive forward. They've got a major contract with one of the automotive companies for trucks, actually, which that scares me. But besides that, and that's all LiDAR technology as well.
Yeah.
So.
Were there any shortages that we didn't expect to happen? I mean, we know semiconductor. Was there anything that surprised you, shortage-wise?
Besides toilet paper, or?
Well, yeah. All right. Yeah.
I did. I always tell people, by the way, is my wife didn't know what I did for 40 years, and now all of a sudden we're talking about it on our walks. But what supply chain really is? It's so, and it really just started because of the toilet paper problem. You start thinking about the world's supply of lumber and wood, things like that. I never thought of that, and that's when Margaret and I talked about how it's really just so volatile.
I think that's to your point, Nicolette. It's a great question. I don't think the surprise was in any one area. I think it was in how extensive it reached. And Mike brings up a valid point. I have friends who are in supply chain, but a lot of our external groups didn't know what we really did. And now it's dinner conversation. So it's really changing kind of the mindset. And folks are really understanding how supply chain impacts their daily lives. To your point, the toilet paper. I couldn't buy soy sauce for a month. Right? I don't know why.
and it just seems to be random things. So like,
Yeah.
all of a sudden, like I couldn't get Gatorade for
Oh, there you go.
like
I had a
12 weeks.
Velveeta issue.
You know? Yeah. So it's like random things because it's sort of filtering through everything. I mean, and that's a good point that both of you bring up. Like, I don't even know if most people knew what the word supply chain really meant until like probably 2.5 years ago, right?
Right.
Guys, I was writing for PartProcure since what now, Brian? And I still didn't know what supply chain was until this year. So
Yeah, that's
how
right.
about that?
Yeah, I think it was something we all took for granted. You know, everybody living their daily lives, we didn't have to think about it because it was such a well-tuned machine that things were on shelves and available for sale wherever you wanted it, when you wanted it. And now that it's not, it has thrust it into the daily conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think a lot of, go ahead.
No, sorry, Margaret.
You know, I think a lot of supply chain professionals, and Mike, we've lived this throughout our careers. This has always been a problem. It's always just been a very specific problem, to your point, Nicolette. It's always been very commodity focused. You know, you had an earthquake in Japan that affected your capacitors, or, you know, you had a diode issue with one manufacturer in Taiwan. You had little spots of areas that were problematic and you could kind of get through those. This was extreme. This was unprecedented. And so I think this just took it to a whole nother level.
There were pockets and it was hidden, right? So it was there was a nickel problem or a palladium problem, and the supply chain professionals were working through those. And so it tended to stay masked to the public that it was.
And they were short. They were usually short stints because, like you mentioned, like a natural disaster, and then you got past that natural disaster, you fixed it, and you moved on. You know, so it was short stints. This has been a very long, run on this. But something Nathan said just made me think of something. Right? You know, things just showed up automatically for us, right? And a lot of that was using like APIs and connections that human beings weren't even touching. Right? We had machines talking to each other, things like that. So how did that? How does that work, right? How does that work from, the logistics or the supply chain point of view?
Nathan, you want to talk about a little bit of the machine to machine?
Yeah. So I guess from a machine to machine perspective, data's always been moving back and forth behind the scenes. Whether it was EDI as, some of the older technologies that help facilitate that, or as we could look into APIs, relatively new in the grand scheme of things. It's always been happening. And it's just a matter of, what data is anybody looking to consume? It's as we continue to progress with more shortages, with more need for data fast, it's become a bigger issue. It's become a bigger topic with a lot of the customers that I've been talking to. It's not, it's things that people hadn't thought about or maybe did take for granted that, I knew that I could just go to a website or I could get that information, that stock and availability information. And now now the expectation is that it's there, instantaneously. It's within your ERP. It's just available.
Right. So did that also change because, right, there's a certain amount of inventory that comes in, right? And because the shortages, it's going out so quick. So the quicker you're getting in there to get your inventory, the quicker you're connecting. So are people benefiting from having sort of like speed on their side, I guess is my point?
I think that's exactly it, Brian. I've got a customer who does, quick turn builds for their customers, and he set up an API with us directly. And so during the middle of the night, his machine's coming in, talking to our machine. Is the product available? Is it the right price point? Release an order. So when his procurement team walks in the next day, they're not getting a list from their ERP system saying, hey, there's 100 parts you need to procure. It's actually, hey, we've already released 80 POs. Here's your material. It's going to be in these dates. Here's the 20 that you have to go deal with. They're already ahead of the curve.
Right.
That's what you want. He who who uses the data better and faster will win.
So they're dealing with the exceptions, and it helps from that perspective. I love the punchline to that, Margaret. That process takes about 6 seconds for them to do that. And so that's when you start thinking about, the old buyer or purchasing person sitting there, placing and chasing.
Yeah.
Right? It's the people that want to adopt that technology, that digital connectivity. They're the ones that, it's just freeing them up. So giving them more time.
Well, and I think to Margaret's point, it's in real time. It's whatever at midnight or whatever. It's just going when it's going, right? It's automatically kicking off. It's automatically searching the inventory, looking for it. Is it there? Purchase it. If it meets the criteria. So it's definitely going to give you an edge.
Right. Yeah.
Well,
go ahead.
Do we want to maybe talk a little bit about how APIs work, just for kind of folks who are tech savvy but don't quite understand the specifics?
Yeah, it's such a complicated it's a complicated thing to understand, because there's nothing really to see. It's that process. When you're talking machine to machine communication, there doesn't need to be that graphical interface that human beings require, and so it is a tough concept to grasp. But it's the same processes that are powering everything on your phone. You're logging into Facebook and getting your Facebook feed. It's all running on an API. It's no different than any of that. So for the electronic component industry, it's we're making pricing information, availability information available, from our servers direct into customer servers.
And I think it's relatively, I want to say it's relatively new. When you're my age, everything's new. But when you start thinking about it, it's probably 5-6 years, Nathan, that we've really been into application program interface or digital connectivity. We can call it a few different things, but we had the early adopters, people that jumped right in and really wanted to think about that customer that Margaret was speaking of, definitely an early adopters. And the nice part is we can use those examples when talking to customers about what big data can do for them, right? And so it really is tomorrow. Even our own people in our own company, right? I don't understand. They got that price from the API. Where'd that come from? Because they can't see it. It's not, so it is different for them until they start to understand the whole concept.
That's a great point. Yeah. You have so many people that say, okay, well, I got it off your website. Well, I can go to my website and I can verify and I can see. But to say, it's pulled right into our system from an API. There's a lot of trust that goes into that. You get rid of that visual layer, and the trust factor has to go up that data is doing what it's supposed to do. It's moving from place to place.
Right. And with the API, I mean, it's other things besides, inventory, pricing, right? What else is in there? Do you guys have like end of life, barcodes? What other information can the users pull in? Because that also becomes very critical, because, when they're ingesting that API, maybe they're visually looking at it in a very different way, or they need other chunks of data. Is there other data they could pull in besides the availability and pricing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as we talk about APIs, EDI, whatever it might be, digital connectivity, it's just a tool. It's like reaching into your toolbox and taking out a hammer or a wrench. You want to make sure you have the right tool for the right job. It comes down to the business process, analyzing that process. What's inefficient? What's not? What do you want to automate? EDI is a little more structured. It's rigid. It's predefined standards. It's fantastic to do what it needs to do when you're trying to replicate a process across a number of different sources. API is much more up to the imagination. If there's a data point that you can use that can help you create an action, that can help you automate a process, it's either going to be there now, and if it's not, ask for it. There's tons of data that's there, and it's not just pricing and availability, but it's parametric information if you want to find substitutes. It's end of life. It's life cycle information to verify that your design is going to be good for the next year. It's all available.
Well, and that's something interesting you just brought up, Nathan, the parametric information, right? So if something's not available, is there something else that you could use?
Right.
Becomes really important, especially with the shortages.
Right.
Yeah, and even just pure substitute information.
Right.
We've already done all that work of, comparing part to part. If part XYZ doesn't work for you, here's another one.
Can we go back to something Mike said for a second? We're talking about, how this is fairly new, 5-6 years. So that's pre-COVID. Now, you talk about the early adopters, but were there some folks who, not early adopters, but kind of were open-minded to getting on board, in the beginning? And did COVID change that for some folks who maybe were hesitant with our, the subsequent shortages? And third part is, if nobody is willing and open-minded, why are they hesitant to?
Sure. So let me jump in first. And
I think there was like 5 questions.
I'm sorry. Let me just ask them all.
I did say I was old before, right? I can't remember that much. But let me just start with the first part, though, is that when I said it's relatively new, it's newer in the electronics field.
For supply
This
chain.
is for supply chain. This has been, APIs have been around for a long, long time. There's been a lot of machine-to-machine interface for a long time, but for distribution and electronics, and for us, it's probably a 6-year journey so far. So that's the first part. What was the second or third question?
Did the subsequent shortages and our new supply chain issues play a role in kind of maybe propelling some people to get on board?
No, I think it was actually before that. So we did have the early adopters, and then we had the next phase of people that started to come in and recognize the fact that they could do other things that would free up their time to do other more important strategic pieces of supply chain. And they didn't have to worry. I use Nathan's example all the time. 80% of the work is done for you sometimes when you can work on the strategic or the last 10 or 20% of the stuff. So that was the second group of people caught that and picked it up. And actually, from an earlier podcast we all had together when we had Kara on and we talked about her coding tools.
Yeah.
Right? And she's the one that said, hey, you don't have to worry about 10 parts out of 200. Right. And so now she's taken a lot of that that routine stuff off of her plate so she can really go chase the hard stuff. And I think one of the third questions was, why do some people resist? Some people, they just haven't figured a way to get the technology into their company. So we deal with a lot of smaller contract manufacturers and people that, build products for people. And it's not easy for them to get the resources available to do that. And then not only that, is going back to Nathan's concept, is they can't touch it, they can't hold it. So it's a little bit harder sell for us for Margaret and I and Nathan to talk to customers that they just don't ever want to, don't want to go there, or is
it that they don't, I mean, and I don't know any other word but trust, right? Is it that they don't trust it because they're not physically going there and typing in like whatever the part number is and seeing that there's those numbers? They're just having to trust the computer telling them
value, or is it not seeing the value, like not being able to properly explain the value to the people who we need buy-in from?
I think it's an understanding as well. I think, COVID and the pandemic really pushed many of us into a more digital world because we didn't have a choice, right? We weren't physically in the same building with folks. We weren't doing work the way we normally did it. So we had to get creative. We had to use the technology at hand. So I think there was a lot of folks that automatically kind of pushed themselves into a more digital framework. You can tell just how we're meeting today, right? Zoom and WebExes, everything exploded from that standpoint. So I think the folks who feel comfortable with software are embracing it and are trying to understand how to utilize it. And there's an onslaught of increase in, computer science, data science, all of those types of fields. Mm-hmm. Big data is not going away. It's going to be king. And I think it's just what's your human nature, right? We're habitual. We don't generally like change. So I think there's a lot of hesitation from that standpoint. If folks are introduced to it and they're comfortable with it and they see the value, it's a perfect word, Nicolette, they see the value that it provides, then they're on board. You have to see the value. And if you've never experienced it, it's kind of like a blind faith, right? So you really do have to surround yourself. I've always said, a good accountant, a good mechanic, and a good software engineer, and I can get through pretty much anything.
What about cost savings? I mean, how would you describe cost savings? Because there are some cost savings. And Brian, you and I were talking about this yesterday, and you brought up the cost savings. So that was something we wanted to talk about. How would you describe cost savings in this situation using APIs?
So I think it depends on where so every company is going to have a different operating expense.
Mm-hmm.
So first off, understand your operating expense, right? So where's your cost going? Is it your human labor, or is it,
Right.
orders? Are you manipulating your POs multiple times over and over and over again? Every time you touch it, there's a cost.
Right.
So the folks who have figured out how to harness that machine to machine piece, to Mike's point, it's 6 seconds. You've just limited your time. Yes, you have an upfront cost of the development piece, either through your own internal IT resources and software programmers or an external third party who could set it up for you. There is an initial cost. Nothing is for free. But once that setup is completed, then you should see the benefits of it. The example that I gave earlier, ironically enough, the fear is, these APIs are going to get set up and then I'm not going to have a job. The company I described, yes, they've altered it. Where he spent his money wasn't, say, on a tactical buyer. He's now looking at investing in more of a commodity manager, somebody more strategic who's looking at more of the analytics, how to use the data, how to engage directly with their customer base, how to negotiate differently with the supply base. So the job's just evolving a little bit. I think it's getting a little bit more fun, actually.
Yeah, and I think Mike pointed out too, like, instead of chasing whatever, 80 parts, you're only chasing 10, right? Those things that may not be available, and you may have to search elsewhere or go to, use a different source to find those parts, or look for a different part in general, so you could look at the parametric information.
Exactly.
So,
and there's a cost. Could you imagine a cost savings of knowing that there's an end of life device on your bill of materials?
Yeah.
And before you even roll it out into production,
yep.
you now have caught yourself. That's a huge. We used to call that a 10-cent problem inside the factory turns into $1,000 problem once it gets to a consumer.
And especially as we talked about those automotive manufacturers re-putting GPS back in.
There you go.
Right?
Later.
Recalls that come with that.
Oh yeah, recalls are no
man.
joke. Those are expensive.
Yeah, so huge cost savings right there. Having that information.
Hey, Brian, why don't you bring up the manufacturers, different manufacturers, distributors. We talked about different distribution channels, and that was something we wanted to talk about. What happens when you're using multiple different...
Right. So, yeah, there obviously, there are multiple APIs out there where you can pull from different, purchasing solutions. So how do these systems work when you sort of bring them all together, right? If you're looking for multiple APIs, how are users implementing things like that? Or buyers, I should say.
I'll jump.
Yeah, I was going to say I have one.
Okay.
I'll jump in, but listen, even in supply chain and what we do every day when we just talk about supply chain is, we all have to have those same capabilities as distributors because it's not a scalable solution if we don't. Now, some of us, like DigiKey, I believe, we have more than the average distributor, but then it's a different one. But so that's our side of the fence. But on the other side is what they build, right? So one of the things that I always talk about is when I sit with a customer and I talk about digital connectivity, a lot of customers don't have the technology or the people, the IT people, to create these APIs, to create the connectivity. And so they may have to go to a third party. So there's third parties out there that do that connect all of us together. And in some cases, they've already made the cake, right? They kind of know how to connect to us. We've already, Nathan and his team have worked to get them on board. So that's one area. I think the biggest challenge typically is getting them to see which way they want to go. Because if they're doing it individually, distributor by distributor, supplier by supplier, they have to have an IT team that can actually do that and write that code. We do a lot of things. Nathan has created a fabulous website where they can come in and try their code and test their code in the sandbox and other things. So and I didn't want to turn that into a DigiKey commercial, but I kind of went.
But to add to that too, it's not necessarily the connection isn't the issue because it's just it's one endpoint of data and that can be mapped into whatever. The cost is initially is the application that's being built on the customer side. I mean, there's got to be a software program that brings this data in, that collates information and then returns it back to that user. There has to be that visual interface at some point.
Right.
And so that's, it's a choice of whether you choose to create your own that does the functions that you want, or you choose to go with some of these third parties that have already done a lot of that for you. But it's that, do you put the big cost up front and build your own, or do you have an incurred cost down the road that's recurring? So
Right.
I think the challenge, I think still, Nathan, is the biggest challenge is integrated, to your point, integrating it into their system. So it then becomes part of their process. When I say them or they, it's the customer. That customer needs to figure a way to integrate that in to make those steps easier, more smooth and automated.
So once they figure out their workflow, if they're using, multi-distributors, right, for certain things, they're just building that into their software. And so it works for them when they bring it into their team itself. Now, do you see, besides private companies, right, we talked a lot about companies and building, do we see a lot of like universities and things like that, or, governments even implementing these APIs for purchasing?
They use the punch-out catalogs a little bit more, I would think. I mean, Nathan, do you agree?
Yeah.
Not necessarily the API piece.
Yeah, when you've got buyers kind of spaced out, the way like a university is set up is just different than what a private company typically is, or you've got different departments that need to requisition and have approvals put into place. The punch-out system is a little bit more geared towards that.
It's almost like an easy button, like the Staples.
Right. So do you want us to talk about punch-out a little bit?
Yeah, you guys talk a little bit about that. Yeah, absolutely.
So again, we talked about it as an easy button, but it's basically like an icon that shows up on their desktop, and the requisitioner would actually go in and find what they wanted. It looks like they're on our website, right? So they can find they want. They put it in the shopping cart. From that point, it then I call it, and maybe I always have it wrong, but it punches out into their SAP system, into their ERP, and then it goes through the approval process, and the PO pushes out the other side, which is all automated at the university level. So we find that I would say that most of the time we're always into some type of punch out process with universities and
Gotcha.
Some of the medical, not medical, but Mill Aerospace people are doing it as well.
Okay.
And it's mostly MRO for those material, maintenance, repair, and operations type products. Things that they don't want to use P cards for, so give you a 1970s term.
So are there, sorry, Nicolette, were you going to ask something?
Finish. You can finish up because I have a random question.
Okay. So, I was going to ask if there's any other places where you're going to see shortages, but so if you have a random question.
I was just gonna randomly ask what's going on in power, because APEC's going on this week, and I'm just curious.
That's right.
If there's anything going on in power you want to talk about, let's talk about it.
Oh gosh. Yeah, we actually have some representation at APEC this week. But he's been busy, so I haven't had much time with him. I've done a couple little email back and forth, but nothing detailed. It's I think power is always an interesting play, especially with all the electric vehicles and that being such a large market. So I think there's a lot of churn. There's a lot of focus on that specific area. But as far as any up-to-date information, I'm not privy. I will next week. We're a week ahead.
Okay, we'll get you back and talk about that.
Okay.
So are there any other areas that you predict, just basically based on what's going on in the world, other things that we're gonna see some other shortages in
before, which
or even like like batteries, right? Like lithium ion and things like that we may see shortages.
Nickel, right? Some of these electric, into the batteries. So some of
there's
that's
a lot
out of Russia, right? So nickel, save your nickels. That'd be expensive.
Is that why I saw a Facebook post about how much my nickels were worth? I was like, check that out.
Right.
I wasn't clicking that. I was clicking.
And just think, you were using the API for Facebook to connect.
Oh yes.
All right. Well, is there anything that we're not asking about that we should be asking about on this topic?
I think we covered quite a bit in a
We did.
short 30. Yeah, no, this was good. I think it was good. We could talk about, that's the problem, right? Every little commodity is going to have its own nuance,
Yeah.
and its own specifics, its own, but are we done? No. I mean, there's so much upheaval going on in the globe right now. Everyone is talking about what happens if China and Russia combine, what happens with Taiwan. There's a lot of what ifs that
Right.
folks are getting really nervous about. And I've got a couple of customers just locally in the Bay that are bringing some of their manufacturing back to the States ASAP, just to kind of, control their supply chain a little bit tighter.
Right. I mean, we've been talking about that for a while, like nearshoring, and we see like some fabs going up, but it's not like you spin up a fab and like,
Right.
6 months later you're up and running, right? That's like a multi-year project. So are we predicting that there's going to be a lot more nearshoring, whether it's, in the US or whatever, in Canada or in North America?
I think, you hit the nail on the head. I think, Mike and I were chatting about it. We've been doing this a long time. And before everything moved offshore and overseas, a lot of it was in-house and in North America. You had a lot of more control over your supply chain end to end. And there was also a lot of longevity. We've almost gotten the feeling where the pendulum swung too far to the other way, right? Just in time and just enough and no visibility, right? Nobody wants to send a forecast because they don't want to get stuck to it. So it's become very, what do we need for next month? What do we need for next quarter? Just very short-sighted. And I think there might be a little bit of a shifting with that. I think there needs to be a longer term vision again, more of a strategy, to your point, Brian, because if we don't get 2 years out, we're never going to get there.
Yeah.
So I think the folks that have a short and long-term plan are probably going to be better set to survive.
So do you think that's also going to affect, right? With that being, do you think that's also going to affect the way they're designing?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Design's making me really nervous right now because I have a lot of my old engineers reaching out, knowing that I work at DigiKey, like, hey, I can't see this chip on your website. So in some cases, they're over designing
Right.
the application because they can't get the chip, right? That's how they're metriced. I need to get my board out in X amount of time.
Right.
So if I can't get the chip I want, I'm going to go get the chip I can get.
Right.
Is it the right cost chip? Maybe not. Right. So, and in some cases, a good engineer is always going to over design. Under design brings you quality problems. There's that cost discussion again.
Right.
So that's been very interesting, is talking to some of my design engineers and that they're just taking very interesting creative design steps.
Right.
So we'll see what happens. That's another shift in the supply chain too.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because you've seen that with some companies in the past. That's just how they sort of operate, right? They over design, so that way, things happen, they keep going, right? Or they're not always looking for like, okay, here's the next chip, or what I mean. Like,
does that affect the cost then?
Oh, for sure.
I mean, logically, I would think so.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
that's where it gets interesting. To Brian's point, I've seen companies where they over design it, get the product out, and then they scream at their procurement team to drive the cost out.
Right.
So it's a strategy.
Yeah.
It just depends.
It almost seems like you need to do that, right? Because you're not going to know what you're going to have for, like you said, probably the next 2 years, right? You're not going to be really sure of what you get your hands on, and that's if it even ever changes, right? It's, until we like spin up fabs, maybe in the U.S., you're gonna always be like, okay, what am I able to get? So back to that just in time. It's going to be rough to design with that just in time mindset. So the engineer is really going to have to sort of shift their design, process and thoughts there.
Going back to the nearshoring, I think it's changed to reshoring.
Right. Yeah. That's a good
Think
point.
about it that way,
Yeah.
because we've kind of let it all go. And so we have to figure a way to get that all back. And that's really, think about US, Canada, Germany, and now even some of the car companies, going back to that chip conversation, is they're all starting to think about, and it is a 5-year problem. It's going to take 5 years to get there. But if you think about reshoring, it's more taking control of my supply chain again.
Yeah.
Instead of giving it and letting other people do it for me, they're going to start taking more control of that. This has probably been the worst. The pandemic created most of this issue, right? But it's funny. I had a customer the other day ask about, I think it was Thailand or one of the countries that was shutting down for a week. And so I started talking about it a little bit. I was like, listen, we're 2 years into this. A week, I mean, that's nothing. That's not even a couple of hockey games, it's nothing. So and even he said the same thing. He says, I don't even know why we asked, because we're so past that, because we went months before that. We were shut down for months. So I don't know. I guess I'm going to go back to I think it's the reshoring, taking control back of your supply chain. What Margaret said. Companies they should be looking a year out, 2 years out of what their requirements are.
That's a good point. Another thing I just thought of as we were talking, right? We see, where Intel's putting the fab in Ohio, right? This is where they finally settled on. Are we going to see certain areas, in the U.S. become sort of like areas where we're going to, put fabs and sort of have like a new, like we had like the steel industry in like a certain area of the U.S. Like, are we going to see fabs go into like certain areas, or are we going to see them like more spread out? Do you guys think?
That's a great question.
That is a great question.
Because I don't know if it's resource constrained, and the reason you'd go there, because the U.S. is saying they'd like to put something in Arizona, right? So that's the government jumping in, and then Intel says, "Oh,
well, let's like, fab needs a lot of water. I'm just saying, like Arizona doesn't really strike me as a place to go."
It's true. It's true.
But yeah, you're right. With it's going to be interesting how they zone these things for these type of fabs. I mean, they're not small facilities,
Right.
Well, everybody, we do appreciate your time today. And this was I think it was an optimistic discussion. As much as there's stuff going on, I feel like I don't feel despair. Right. No. I don't feel that at all. I that's at least the vibe that I get from this conversation. So we just got to kind of buckle in and, like Mike said, take control back. Right. Let's take control back.
Reshore. I like that word. Reshore.
Yeah.
Reshore.
So for our listeners, we will have some links and descriptions and bios and everything we talked about today, and you'll get to learn more about our three guests today, as well as some of the stuff that they're working on over at DigiKey. So again, thank you so much. We do appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.